Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. So glad that you joined us both in person and virtually for the final lecture in our annual Filson Friday series. Before we begin, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Dinsmore and Scholl LLP, and acknowledge the generous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities and its Sustaining the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan initiative. With this support, the Filson will present a series of public programs and launch Resurrecting the First American West, a digital exhibit on the diverse Ohio Valley frontier, which we'll see previewed in part today. And to thank you again for joining us for Women in the First American West. Our speaker, Maureen Lane, has an MA in American Studies with a focus on American art and material culture from Penn State. She also has an MA in Museum Studies from Johns Hopkins. Her interests include women's history, American textiles, and American art. She is inventorying, researching, and cataloging the Filson's museum collection and working towards making the museum collection accessible online. She's part of the First American West project team. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits at these two microphones at the front of the room, or of course, if you're joining us virtually, drop those questions in the chat and I'll get them in front of our audience. Please join me in welcoming Maureen Lane.
Hello, thank you for being here today. Before settlers took to the Oregon Trail, which opened around 1830, Kentucky was part of the Trans-Appalachian West, also known as the First American West. In 1750, Dr. Thomas Walker was the first Euro-American to lead a party through the Cumberland Gap, and Kentucky quickly became a linchpin as England, Virginia, profiteers, along with indigenous tribes who all claimed Kentucky as part of their ancestral homeland, all vied control of Kentucky. All the meanwhile, Western colonial expansion is pushing westward. Kevin Barksdale summed it up really nicely when he said, Kentucky is at the center of the political, economic, and cultural development of North America and the broader Atlantic world for the next 50 years. This is just a little bit of background as to why the First American West is so important. In 2002, the Filson developed a groundbreaking project that gave unprecedented access to its online collection for archival materials, as well as historic artifacts. These documents, they documented the experience of Kentuckians as they moved into the first Western frontier. However, with the rapid change of technology, the platform that was hosting the project became obsolete over a course of 20 years, and that project had to be retired. So that led us to creating Resurrecting the First American West. And this project has been going on for the past 8 months as Filson staff have been cleaning and kind of renewing that old data so that it will work with our fresh technology. And they've also been combing the archives and museum collections for new materials. And these materials will add to our understanding of a variety of perspectives of people who lived on the First American West frontier, including the experience of women, who I'm going to be focusing on today. The primary source materials that are coming out of this project and that you will see today, they will be premiered on an online exhibit through our Mecca site, and that project will be publicly accessible, and that will premiere sometime in early 2023. And it will include lesson plans for teachers, and then there'll be other presentations and programs that go along with it. By 1790, there are more than 73,000 free and enslaved people living in Kentucky. Land was acquired a variety of ways and was bought and resold, sometimes with competing claims for the same parcel of land. It is said that more land was bought than physically existed in Kentucky. While Kentucky was advertised as a land of opportunity, in reality, only 1 in 4 men that came to Kentucky became landowners. Many became tenant farmers, paid laborers, or left Kentucky altogether. So what this means is that many families that came to Kentucky lived in economic uncertainty, and this affects women's lives as well. The experience that women have on the frontier varied based on their socioeconomic status, as well as their status as a free or enslaved woman. As we look at the experiences of some of the women that are represented in our collection, it's really important to keep in mind that our collection primarily documents the experience of upper and upper middle class women, white women. We have very few resources that document the experiences of enslaved, Indigenous, or landless women in our collection through their point of view. Where possible, though, we do try to document their presence through the frontier experience. While many women travel to the frontier from the East, Elizabeth Logan is an interesting person because she was born here in the Kentucky frontier in 1784, the same year the Second Treaty of Paris is ratified, ending the Revolutionary War. For nearly 2 decades, her father, Benjamin Logan, was at the center of violent conflicts with the Shawnee, who were seeking to contain and dissuade Euro-American settlement in their lands. This resulted in raids against the colonizers, who in turn raided Shawnee communities, and a violent cycle that continued throughout the American Revolution and in the years that followed. And this really defines the early years of frontier settlement. Logan served in Lord Dunmore's War when Virginians marched against the Shawnee in 1774 to push the Indigenous tribes north of the Ohio River. They wanted to oust the Indigenous population and gain control of Kentucky once and for all, securing it for Virginian settlement. When he was there, Logan met George Rogers Clark, Simon Kenton, and a number of surveyors who had been to Kentucky. After Lord Dunmore's War, Virginia solidified its claim on Kentucky by offering 400 acres to any man who would build a cabin and raise a patch of corn on that land. They were also given 1,000 acres of preemptive right to acquire adjacent land if they were successful. Logan made his claim in 1775 and built Logan's Fort. And within 1 year, he brought his wife and his newborn son to the frontier with him. The reason I wanted to go through all of that is because it really sets the stage for the world that Elizabeth Logan was born into. It defines the time and place where she and other women who colonized Kentucky were part of. Elizabeth married Martin D. Hardin in 1809 when she was 25 years old. He was a politician and fought in the War of 1812, and the family moved to Locust Hill outside of Frankfort, Kentucky. But despite their advantages, they struggled to maintain their farm and they could not make it a success. And at the age of 23, in 1823, at the age of 39, Elizabeth was widowed with 3 children, and she was pregnant with her 4th child. And she was $50,000 in debt. That is a sizable amount for that time. For the next 7 years, she struggled to maintain the farm by herself. And eventually she met cabinet maker Porter Clay, and he's the brother of Henry Clay. And they got married around, I think 1830 it was. And it's really interesting because they sold the farm to kind of get back what they could from it. And they bought land in Illinois where her adult son was, and they bought the land in her name. Apparently, Porter Clay believed that all the money she had from her previous marriage was hers to kind of control and manage as she wanted to, which during the time of coverture wasn't normal. Usually the husband would come in and dictate how women's money would be managed at that time. Unfortunately, though, that marriage was fairly short-lived, and they ended in separation. And it's interesting to note that separation and divorce did happen on the Kentucky frontier. People kind of think of that as a 20th century institution, but it's not. There are women and men who are being separated, abandoned, and divorced throughout the 19th century. While some women saw Kentucky as an opportunity to improve the futures of their children, other women found the move to the frontier unbearable. Land in the original colonies was expensive and it was more difficult to obtain as the population increases. Tobacco was known to strip the land of vital nutrients and render land barren. And this drove a lot of families west with the promise of tracts of land which would sustain their growing families for years to come. Samuel Meredith Jr. viewed Kentucky as a land of opportunity. He compared it to the kingdom of heaven. His wife, Betsy, did not share his point of view. She wrote, "I have just departed my poor dear mother in a great deal of distress about my going to Kentucky. I suppose there never was a person who went to that country more reluctant than I." Betsy's brother, John Breckenridge, was a lawyer in a very competitive market, and his farm in Virginia wasn't doing very well. Kentucky offered him a new opportunity to support his growing family. His wife, Polly, also did not want to go to Kentucky. During the journey to Kentucky, John commented to another traveler his disappointment that his wife hadn't even smiled once since they left their homeland. He just didn't understand why she wasn't excited to be picking up and moving her family here. Annie Christian traveled to the she travels the Wilderness Road in 1785. And she wrote, "Had I any idea of it being half as bad as I found it, no inducement on this earth would have encouraged me to attempt it." And she urged her sister not to even think of making the crossing. Later, Annie was widowed on the frontier and found herself taking a reluctant role in managing her husband's salt works so that she could carve out a future for her young son. 21-year-old Marianne Corliss was the daughter of John Corliss. He was a merchant and ship owner from Rhode Island who lost his fortune during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. He saw Kentucky as an opportunity for new prospects and to regrow his fortunes. I think his daughter did as well. She was very enthusiastic about traveling to Kentucky, and she was single, and she would have been around 21 years of age when she made the journey. Her mother stayed at home with their younger children until their house could be prepared for the rest of the family to come. They took the Ohio River, but first they traveled overland through Pennsylvania, which included an early winter hike through the Appalachian Mountains on foot. When they reached the Allegheny Mountains, Marianne commented on how high they were and how narrow and steep the roads were. And she wrote, "As for me, I am so hardened that nothing short of 100 feet can frighten me." But she did fall during her journey and she injured her knee and her ankle. And this continued to fester for more than a month after she arrives in Kentucky. And at one point she wrote home that she thought she might lose her leg, but that never happened. Not long after Marianne and her brothers arrive in Kentucky, her father drops them off and basically turns around, leaves them there, and heads on back to Rhode Island. He had a lot of business affairs to take care of, and he had lawsuits that he was engaged in, and he was going to retrieve the rest of the family. So Marianne and her brothers were left on the frontier, and they were there to kind of get the cabin set up. Her brothers were in charge of farming. I don't think her father was very excited or happy with the way they had managed the farm because he would complain about it in some of his letters. But Marianne kind of struggled with being left alone as a young woman in a strange area without her parents. And she wrote, "Father may say I ought to command my feelings always. I know it. It has been my study ever since I have been left to act for myself. The task is difficult, but without vanity, I may say I have obtained a command in a degree more than I expected." The rest of her family came to Kentucky about 10 months after her arrival. These letters are really important because there are few instances of letters in the Filson's collection in which women are documenting their move to the Kentucky frontier and how they were feeling. And in fact, a lot of the accounts of the travel to Kentucky tend to be from men and their point of view. Enslaved people came to the Kentucky frontier alongside Euro-Americans from the very beginning. They supported early expeditions, they cleared land, built cabins, cleared roads, cultivated crops, and prepared and preserved food. Their work was vital to the early settlement of Kentucky, as well as to the economic prosperity enjoyed by the Euro-American settlers. Less than 1 year after the discovery of the Cumberland Gap, the first enslaved man accompanied Christopher Gist on his expedition into Kentucky. The first enslaved woman, named Dolly, traveled with Daniel Boone's party in 1775 to cook and maintain camp for the expedition. By 1800, there are more than 40 enslaved people in Kentucky. Half of them are women. Enslaved women worked on the fields, did laundry, ironing, they nursed and reared children. They also did highly skilled work, which we'll see examples of in a little bit, including midwifery, cooking, spinning, weaving, and sewing. When possible, I will include information about the people that were enslaved in the households of the women we're looking at, because it's important to show the prevalence on slavery in the frontier and also the prevalence of slavery in women's lives. Caroline Preston was born in Fincastle, Kentucky. Fincastle County was part of Virginia then, now part of Kentucky. She was the daughter of a Revolutionary War soldier, and she married William Preston in 1802 at the age of 17. They moved to Louisville in 1814 after William inherited about 1,000 acres of land from his father. One of the more important jobs that women did on the frontier was the preparation of 3 daily meals and the preservation of food for the winter. This was very labor-intensive work, and the family's survival depended on it. A large part of the frontier diet consisted of meat. So men were responsible for the acquisition of game, which would include deer, bison, turkey, bear, and fowl. But as the settlement developed, pork and beef became more prevalent as domesticated animals were brought through the frontier. Women were responsible for growing fruits and vegetables. They cared for chickens, and they milked the cows and made dairy products. In an age where there's no refrigeration and you need to preserve food for the winter, meats were smoked, salted, or pickled. And here we see Caroline Preston's recipe for pickled beef. This recipe calls for 8 pounds of salt. That's a lot of salt. It also calls for 1.5 pounds of brown sugar and 2 ounces of saltpeter. This is important because we know that salt was a valuable commodity on the frontier. And in the Bullitt family records, Annie Christian documented that she paid her workers in barrels of salt. This recipe is actually 3 pages long. Here we see 2 pages, and it lays out the complex process of pickling. And this took days to prepare and complete. And so this would just be one of the items they would be making. They would also pickle and preserve fruits, vegetables, anything that they could get to last them through the winter. Caroline's recipe book gives us some insight into other activities that women did, including the preparation of wine, beer, and cider, as well as home remedies and yarn dyes, which are all found within the pages of her cookbook. We know that there are 28 enslaved people in Caroline's household, and that enslaved women likely helped with much of the cooking and food preservation in her home. On the left is Anne Rogers Clark Gwathmey, the eldest sister, of George Rogers Clark. After the Revolutionary War, George sent for his parents, his younger brother William, and 3 of his unmarried sisters to come live in Louisville with him. Anne was already married and had children, so she didn't move into the frontier until 13 years later in 1797. She arrives just 1 year before her mother died and 2 years before her father died. Likely traveling with Anne were 5 of her 12 children, ages 2 through 15. They purchased 335 acres and built a home near Harrods Creek, which is around River Road and Wolfpen Branch, close to her sister Lucy Cron's house in near Locust Grove. This proximity to her sister provided her with a really strong social network, which was important for women at the time. And the Guathmies enslaved 20 individuals on their estate. Pictured next to her is her son, Jonathan Clark Guathmy. He was born in 1774. And next to him is his wife, Anne Buchanan Booth, born in 1788. Jonathan bought 5 acres of land along Walnut Street in Louisville, where he built a 2-story brick house. He operated the Indian Queen, which was a hotel at 6th and Main Streets. It was advertised as a house of entertainment, but it was considered one of the main social and political hubs of the city at that time. They had a lot of different events, including exhibitions and concerts, but it was also said to be a rough place. It attracted people from all over the territory, and there was quite a bit of drinking, cigar smoking, and billiards playing. In 1816, he sold his home and he moved his family to New Orleans. And there he operated the Merchant's Coffee House, one of the oldest coffee houses in the city. He died in 1824. His wife, Anne Booth, did not have an easy life. She married Jonathan in 1800 when she was 12 years old. He was 26. She was 13 when she gave birth to their first daughter, who died less than 6 weeks later. They didn't have another child until 5 years later. And between that time in 1825, Anne lost both of her parents, 2 more preschool-aged children, and her husband. In her senior years, 2 of her adult children preceded her in death. I think her story is important because it illustrates the difficulty of being a mother at this time period and the many losses that women were faced with during their lifetime. Abigail Pope Oldham Churchill is also a mother of note in the Filson's collection. Her maternal grandfather and her father both served in the Revolutionary War, and between them, they acquired more than 3,000 acres of land in Jefferson County. Her father, William Pope, also fought in the Northwest Indian War, and he died in battle in 1791 at the Battle of Wabash. Abigail was 2 years old when her father died. Her mother, Penelope Pope, who was married when she was 14 years old, was 22 years old when she became a widow with 4 young children. She then married Henry Churchill 2 years later after William's death. When Abigail became a teenager, she married Samuel Churchill, her stepfather's brother, just 2 weeks after her 14th birthday in 1802. He was 24. She gave birth to their first child when she was 15, and she had a child almost every other year for the next 30 years. She gave birth to the last of her 15 children when she was 44 years of age. In 1810, the Churchills enslaved 43 individuals, and that increased to 75 in 1820. The sampler seen to the right was made by one of Abigail's daughters, Abigail Prather Churchill, born in 1817. It was made when she was between the ages of 11 and 13 years of age when she attended Nazareth Academy near Bardstown, Kentucky. There are 2 other unsigned samplers from the Churchill family in the Filson's collection, and we know that 2 of her sisters also attended the same academy. And so we're hoping that they may be their samplers, but we need to do more research on them as they're not signed. This sampler is signed A.P. Churchill, and it's inscribed, "Work done in Nazareth, June 3rd." And we believe that this date indicates the commencement of a class for which the project was made. Unfortunately, she did not include the year that she made it, which would have been helpful, but our volunteer researcher, Jean Marlowe, was able to uncover her school records at Nazareth, and she was only there for between the ages of 11 and 13. So we were able to narrow down the time period for that. Girls were taught sewing at a young age, and if they were part of an affluent family like the Churchills, they would be sent to a private school. And there they would learn the ornamental arts, and that would include embroidery, music, dancing, etiquette, drawing, and French, all the skills a young lady of the time needed. The primary purpose, though, of Nazareth Academy was religious instruction for the children of Catholic families who had moved east and have come into Kentucky. With the onset of the antebellum period a little bit later, schools like this began to offer more serious study for women, more academic study. The largest collection we have of textiles from this period come from the household of Eliza Tyler Sturgeon of Jefferson County. This quilt is the oldest quilt in our collection, one of my personal favorites, and was made between 1800 and 1825. The quilt has alternating strips of a hand-woven cloth that we believe was made here in Jefferson County, and these alternate with a commercial indigo print that would have been imported into the United States and then purchased through a merchant. It's hard to tell by this photo, but this quilt is more than 10 feet long on each side. It's massive. Eliza's grandfather first came to Kentucky in 1780. He acquired a land warrant for 1,000 acres, which was then distributed amongst his sons and a nephew in a network of interconnected farms located near Taylorsville Road and Station Road. Part of these farms now comprise a Blackacre Conservancy. The original 1.5-story house that Eliza grew up in still stands adjacent to Blackacre behind a more modern home that was built later in the period. Eliza married Thomas Sturgeon in 1816, and he died just 7 years into their marriage. He was 28, she was 31, and they had 3 young children. Years after her death, her cousin wrote a letter reminiscing about her, and she stated that after Thomas died, Eliza took over the management of the farm and that she was a better farmer than most of her neighbors. She also mentioned that there was an enslaved woman, unnamed, that helped Eliza to manage the house, manage the farm, and that she was also instrumental in managing the 6 other enslaved people on the property. Eliza died suddenly of cholera in 1833. She was 42, and her 3 young sons were all under the age of 18. They went to go live with one of Eliza's brothers. The farm was sold, and it netted a sizable trust for each of her children. And Eliza's sugar chest and 11 textiles are now part of the Filson's collection. Did Eliza make these textiles herself? We don't have any letters or journals to provide direct evidence. So we need to look at Eliza within the context of her time. It's possible that textile production occurred on her uncle's farm. And according to the National Register of Historic Places, we know the Tylers cultivated wheat, corn, oats, and hay as their primary crops, but there's no mention of cotton or flax. But we do know that her uncle Moses did raise sheep. And we know that there were professional spinners in the area that sold spools of spun cotton on the Kentucky frontier. On the Moses farm, there's also evidence of an outbuilding with high ceilings and no chimney that is similar to other documented loom houses on the frontier. They're not sure if this was used as a loom house, but it's a possibility. It's possible that Eliza made these textiles on her family farm, or that she had professional help or from local spinners and weavers, or that she had help from enslaved spinners or weavers. We just don't know. Here we see a section of a raised embroidery whitework, also known as candle wicking, and this was made by Elizabeth Randall Nichols around 1816 in Muhlenberg County. The family narrative states that it was homespun from cotton grown on her mother and father's farm. While cotton wasn't grown as an export crop in Kentucky, there is evidence that it was grown for local and home use. Whitework textiles were made from natural, undyed fabrics that were usually embroidered, woven, or quilted. They were most prevalent in Kentucky between 1800 and 1830, and usually made by girls in their teen years. Elizabeth was 15 when it was said that she made this coverlet. And thanks to the work of local Kentucky historian Laurel Horton, we know quite a bit about the production of white work in Kentucky. Textiles in museum collections often come with stories of being homespun and home woven, and we often have no way to prove this. For years, historians have debated the validity of these romantic stories, noting the prevalence of professional spinners and weavers. And we know up until the Revolutionary War that a lot of cloth was bought, including household goods, and imported from Europe because it was cheaper than making it at home. However, in backcountry areas, we know that women often made household and bed linens. And we know during the Revolutionary War, there are accounts of women boycotting British goods, and because they wanted to make their own cloth at home. And Laurel Horton also implies that this continued during the War of 1812, when there were embargoes against British goods once again. Horton found evidence that many white works in Kentucky are indeed homespun and home woven using locally available fibers. And she worked with a conservator to analyze fibers in several collections throughout the state of Kentucky. This is supported by research that Lou Tate did in the 1930s using the James Weir store ledgers. These ledgers are in the Filson's collection, and they date from 1813 to 1814, and they're from Muhlenberg County, the same county that this textile is from. Tate found that families did not buy blankets, coverlets, or household items through local merchants. However, they did buy spinning wheels, dyes, hackles, cotton and wool cards, indicating that families were engaged in the production of homemade cloth. In addition, she found that women were selling excess yarn and cloth that they made to Weir, who was then selling it to markets in New Orleans. And we do know that women did buy luxury cloth that was imported from Europe, but usually that was for things like clothing, and they weren't rather than home textiles. There's evidence that enslaved women were skilled spinners and weavers. This document is an agreement from the Bullitt family papers in which William Bullitt hired out Annie, an enslaved woman, to do weaving. There are also ads in the Kentucky Gazette that document the presence of enslaved spinners and weavers throughout the frontier. While much of the work they have done is undocumented, we do occasionally see items in collections in which oral family history indicates that items may have been made by enslaved craftspeople. According to family narrative, this bed sheet was made by an enslaved weaver from flax that was grown on their farm in Fayette County. The farm was owned by Dabney Carr Overton. In 1830, Overton enslaved 32 people, including 20 female children and adults. The family narrative for this linen sheet states that it was made in 1816 by Betsy Breckenridge Meredith, sister of John Breckenridge. We talked about them a little earlier when we were talking about the reluctance to come to the frontier. The family narrative states that the flax was grown and spun and woven on Winton Plantation by enslaved people. The family narrative also states that Betsy made it. So which story is true? We don't know. We do know that the Merediths enslaved 38 people, and by 1820, they enslaved 48 people. And it's possible that Betsy oversaw the work or that she took credit for the work that the enslaved craftspeople did. These items that we looked at today are a sample of materials from the Filson's collection that document the first American West. They really just provide a snapshot of what we have. There are many, many more items which we'll be sharing on the First American West project. In addition, as part of this project, I've created a really full bibliography, which I will be putting on our website in the next couple of weeks. There's a lot of great literature and scholarship about the many complexities of women's lives on the frontier. It's too much to go into in a single presentation. But if you're interested in the topic, I really recommend reading some of these resources. I'd like to remind people that the library, just like our library and archive collection, our museum collection is fully accessible to members of the public, and you can request and make a research appointment to look at any of these items in person. And it's something that makes our collection really, really special. If you're interested in helping with the First American West project, we're looking for volunteers. We are looking for people to help transcribe manuscripts from our collection from this period. They've been scanned and they've been added to an online portal, and you can do the transcription and enter it right on to this page. It's kind of like a wiki page if you've ever done that before. And it's really easy to sign up for an account. Currently, there are 80 items on there, but we'll be adding more in the upcoming weeks and months. And it's a really great way to get involved with the project. Here's one of my favorite pages that's already been transcribed. And here we see Caroline Preston again, part of her cookbook. And somebody has transcribed already her recipe for yarn. And I think they did the dye for blue yarn, which is really cool. So this concludes my talk, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay. We want to remind you to use the two microphones here.
Yes, thank you so much, Maureen. And while we're thinking of questions, please go to whichever microphone is closest to you so that everybody in the audience can hear and our folks joining us virtually can hear. I'll start us off. What were some of the challenges that you experienced in trying to find these women's stories, both in the museum collection and in our manuscript collections? What hurdles do we have to overcome?
Sure. Well, there's actually quite a few. First of all, women aren't as available in the legal records and official records of this period because women are covered under the law of coverture, which means that once they become married, their identity, their assets, if they had land or money coming into the marriage, is now under the control and management of their husband. They cannot sign into legal contracts without their husband's permission. And you don't see women in the public sphere as much because of this. So it's harder to trace them through legal documents, although our researcher did find some of these women's names, including Abigail Churchill, pop up in land records because Kentucky did have a dower law, a pretty complex dower rights law, where women would control up to 1/3 of a husband's asset. And this was because they didn't want women to go into poverty with dependent children when their husbands died. And so we see women pop up because the husbands needed their permission sometimes to sell certain parcels of land. But there aren't a lot of journals. There aren't very many letters. There's some letters, but we have mostly what we have is through material culture and objects that they left behind. Your question, please.
Have you found any wills from women from this period? And if so, what kind of bequests did they make? And does that tell you about their conditions on the frontier?
That's a great question. One of the ones that I found the most interesting was for Carolyn Preston, the woman who had the cookbook. And we see her husband when before he dies, he asserts Carolyn's agency, again, as a woman who doesn't have a lot of legal rights. And he does that because he reminds his male executors. So when a man dies, a man is appointed to handle the estate for his wife and underage children. And he reminds his executor that he wants his wife to have the full 1/3 dower right, because they may not necessarily get that. And that she had land that her father gave her before they came into the marriage. And he reminded him that that land was hers and that she should be able to do with it as she pleases without any interference. And that he wanted her to have the ability to manage his estate for his children without any interference. He didn't want them to have an allowance. He wanted her to have the assets and control over the assets. And then what's really cool about her will when she dies is she takes that land that her father gave her and she stipulates that it has to go for the benefit of her daughter. And then it's to be passed down in trust to only female heirs. And she stipulates specifically no male heir should ever benefit from this land or money. And if you don't have a female heir, then you are to wait until a female heir comes along to do anything with the money. So she was really empowered and kind of used the system to get what she needed to ensure the future of other women in her family. So she had a lot of agency in that way.
Hi.
Hi.
Early in your presentation, you showed a slide naming the first enslaved man and the first enslaved woman in Kentucky. What's the evidence that tells us that?
So for the enslaved man, I did not have a name. And that was, there have been a number of articles and scholarship done in the Kentucky Historical Register about the early enslaved people who came to Kentucky. And so that has been pretty well documented through letters and accounts. The first enslaved woman, we know who she was enslaved by. I didn't make a note. I want to say it's Carlton, and she came along with Susanna Boone Hayes, who was Daniel Boone's married daughter. And there were accounts of that as well.
So we know that there weren't earlier, less recorded circumstances.
There could be. Yeah, there absolutely, I mean, there could absolutely be, but in that time, there's fewer records. The records relating to enslaved people, often they're not named. Sometimes they are named. And early on, their presence wasn't necessarily noted until they became, I don't like to say it this way, but when they became a commodity, there's more records related to enslaved people in in Kentucky.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
What was the approximate price per acre of land in Kentucky, say in 1800, 1815, 1820? You have mentioned that several different people came accepting the land grants, but then they prospered and bought more land. And I was just curious as to what the price of that land might be.
So that's a great question. And the land acquisition and sale is actually very complex, and I'm not an expert in that. I don't know if my colleague Jim Holmberg's here. He's more of an expert on that. But I will say that we know that a lot of people were getting grants if they served in the military, or they were getting these preemptive rights to acquire more land. And I know that they were then turning it around and selling it at a much higher rate. I don't know what the rate is, and that's a great question. But I do know that they were turning around and selling it and reselling it, and they were speculating, and it was creating chaos because some people were claiming parcels of land, and then other people were coming along later and putting their cabin and corn, and they're claiming part of that land. And then for decades, there are cases throughout the Kentucky land courts where people are, it's just mass confusion from my understanding. It's a very complex process, but really fascinating.
Yes, my third great grandmother was born in Kentucky, and she was one of the Taylors. And when she married in 1820. First husband and 2 children died. I assume one of the epidemics that went through, but she remarried, and in 1830 had a child. 7 years later, her second husband died, And in 1839, I believe, or 1840, she had moved back to, they were in Owensboro, moved back to Louisville. And she had a very detailed will because she had a child who was very young, and she listed all of the trustees and which members of her family were to be taken care of. And it was such a complicated thing that in 1850, when the son was 21, he sued some of the guardians, not his relatives, but the others, for mishandling money.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note because women did have multiple marriages. They had dower rights. They had money from their previous husbands. Sometimes women inherited land. I've seen cases from their father or grandfather. And so they're trying to protect their land and preserve that for their children, when legally the overall legal system really wants, women don't really have a legal voice per se, like they can't do contracts. But wills were one way that women were able to really kind of try to protect that money and have a voice in where they want it to go. If their husband had died. Now, if their husband was still living, then when she died, he decided where everything went.
Yes. I wondered if you found any record of free persons of color living in the Louisville area. I think Blaine Hudson has recorded some of the statistics, but I've never seen any letters or diaries or anything that made it personal.
That's a great question. And it's not something that I looked at for this particular talk, but like you said, Blaine Hudson's doing that. And I know, I don't know if in the Filson's collection, we have a lot of records of free people of color. Most of the records that we have are from enslavers who enslaved individuals, and that's how we know information about them through letters, ledgers, contracts, and things like that. That's a great question, and it's just not an area, unfortunately, that I looked at for this period. But thank you for your question.
We've got a question from one of the Zoom participants asking about geographical distribution of collections and records. Are there any parts of the state that are sort of more rich in collections than others, or more rich in records than others? And what could be some of the reasons for that?
That's a great question. And so some of the areas that we looked at today, we had quite a few that were in Jefferson County because that's where we are. And I think a lot of families who collected and maintained and then donated items to us from Jefferson County, and that's why they came to us. But we've today also looked at items from Fayette County. We saw Muhlenberg County, and I want to say there was we have a couple other counties, maybe Meade. I don't know if one of these. Yes. And we have other items from Logan County or Lincoln County as well. Our collections are kind of spread all over the state with our highest concentration in Jefferson. And I think we get some Fayette County, but you have the University of Kentucky and also Kentucky Historical Society, which are a little closer to the Fayette County. So you're gonna see more items from there. But in doing the research on white work, Western Kentucky University has a wonderful collection, and they had their white work collection from this period on display last summer. And they also have quite a few materials. And some of our families that I have found related items in Kentucky Historical Society, Western Kentucky University. So they're kind of all spread around. Sure. So the question was, are those collections online and can you access them on the web? And so the answer to that is in 2023, all of the items that you saw, plus thousands of more manuscripts, other artifacts that you didn't see today, will be accessible through an online exhibit for First American West. And then the rest of the museum collection We're inventorying it, and we hope to get the painting collection and the textile collection online within the next year or so. And then we'll keep adding collections as we get through the inventory.
For those of you who don't follow our social media, go on to our Facebook or Twitter page, because a couple of weeks ago, we had a really amazing set of photos of lots of these paintings and textiles in this room set up right here, being professionally photographed to go into First American West. And there's some really, really fascinating images of that process, that photography process, and the lighting and everything. You get a very different sense of what this room can do. Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you all so much for the really wonderful conversation. Can we get another
Thank
round
you.
of applause for Maureen?
Thank you for coming.